Welcome back to our study of apologetics. This is lecture 4.2, week 4, content lecture 2. And in this, we're going to wrap up the Guinness book. And I want to just reiterate what I've said before. I just think this is a great piece of work. It's the distillation of a man's life spent doing apologetics. There's a sense in which in this book the quotes are worth more than the price of the book. I don't know how many times you found yourself underlining or putting a star next to a statement either that he made or a quote that he derives from someone else. But I have quite a few of those in my copy. Chapter 10 is called Beware the Boomerang, and here he's going to talk about hypocrisy in the Christian faith, something that Christians are oftentimes accused of. Chapter 11, Kissing Judases, is a very wonderful treatment, and we're going to get to that in just a few minutes. And then finally brings it down to the commitment, charting the journey that people have to make when it comes to changing a worldview or coming to know Christ or committing themselves to the Christian faith or in whatever other kind of language you may want to put it. He begins with a little discussion here of Julian the apostate. The apostate, will not spend time on that for just the sake of time. You can look that up in a history book at some point if you're a little vague on that history. But he wants to talk about hypocrisy. And he wants to indicate the fact that there is such a thing as hypocrisy, and that hypocrisy can be found in the church, and that hypocrisy can be found everywhere. And in fact, there's a sense in which everyone is a hypocrite at some level. He talks about levels of hypocrisy at the end of the chapter. Has a number of quotes in the early part of the chapter from either Christian people or critics of Christian people who are saying, where is genuine Christianity? And of course, that's a good question. One quote that he doesn't have, or one reference he doesn't have, is one to Gandhi, about in which Gandhi was asked, after he returned to India, after his years in England and his years in South Africa, returned to England, someone asked him why he was not a Christian. He'd spent that time studying law in England and to some degree studying theology. And his answer was, I'd be a Christian if not for the Christians. Well, I mean, this is something that we have to own up to. And the fact is that whatever church you or I have been in, we have known something about hypocrisy. And in fact, if we look deep into our own hearts, we would recognize that there is hypocrisy there as well. And so what he does here in this chapter is he talks about the fact that hypocrisy is something part of life, something we have to learn how to live with, and yet at the same time it's something that we have to battle with in terms of our own personal relationship to God and our relationship in the face of the world. He has several steps here that he wants to get to. So let me just sort of one by one mention them and what he's trying to get across in each step. Step 1, he says, we're all hypocrites now. Deception is endemic to humanity. We are all hypocrites. And that's true. I've known some very honest people in my life, but I've never known anyone whom I got to know well who was completely honest about everything. And of course, I'm not asking people to bear their dirty laundry before the watching world. But the fact is that we always harbor some things. I have one person in mind that's in my family. Now, I'll not go any farther than that. And this person has been, over the years, so honest that at times I was shaken by her or his honesty. But then in a conversation many years later, I asked a question about this person's relationship with the person that they came to marry and whether they had divulged a certain set of certain piece of information to that person, and they said no. And so that's probably the most honest person I know, and yet at a certain level we hold back. And he said that this is simply something that we need to recognize is part of our life, that we are all hypocrites. But the second step is to clarify the issues. And when he talks about clarifying the issues, he says it's important to understand that hypocrisy is all about the gap between truth and lies, integrity and falsehood. If a lie is an attempt to deceive others without their consent, hypocrisy is a lie told in deeds rather than in words. So in other words, we sometimes are hypocrites in deeds, even if we're not hypocrites in the words that we say. And of course, if you go to the Bible, you're going to find all kinds of messages against hypocrisy. Jesus in Matthew 23, in the parables that he told before the Pharisees and the scribes there. You find it in Jeremiah, you find it in Isaiah, you find it all over the Bible, that the great prophets of the faith have struck at the issue of religious hypocrisy over and over again. Step 3, appreciate the social benefits of hypocrisy. And that's kind of an interesting turn here. I wasn't quite expecting that the first time I worked through this material. But he makes the statement, he says, if we had no faults, we would not take so much pleasure in noticing those of others. All right, that's an interesting comment. And hypocrisy is the homage that vice pays to virtue. He does deal with the fact that self-love is important, but self-love elevated to a certain height brings us to a paradoxical kind of experience. Self-love that masks its real motives and mimics true love, and in so doing creates the paradoxical effect that private vices may work for the public good. And he gives some examples there. So what sometimes appears as generous philanthropy is nothing more than prideful love of self. But of course the philanthropy is still there. So there are some positive benefits to hypocrisy, even though we ought to be constantly working at rooting out the hypocrisy in our lives. Step 4, remember where moral seriousness came from. And of course, moral seriousness comes from God. It comes from Scripture. Step 5, say no to retaliation and dare to confess. And the whole issue of daring to confess is something that we all need to hear. If I were writing this chapter, I probably would have included a caveat about confession. We don't need to confess everything to everybody, but certainly we need to confess our hypocrisy at the level at which people have experienced us as the hypocrite. I can tell you some very scary stories about some confessions in churches and in chapel services that should never have taken place, but nonetheless. And then finally, step 6, submit to the toughest counter-hypocrisy program ever. And that, of course, is the Christian faith and what he calls us to. So, great discussion of that. Quickly moving on to chapter 11, Kissing Judases. In this chapter, he's going to talk about the integrity of the Christian faith and the fact that the integrity of the Christian faith and the integrity of the authority of the Bible are being threatened today. They're not just being threatened from the world without. They've always been threatened by the world without. And they're not just being threatened by liberals, so to speak, that is, those who maintain a position in the church but have long ago left the faith once delivered to the saints. But the whole issue is that we find a confrontation and a conflict with biblical truth, even among those who profess to be evangelicals. This is a fine chapter. This is a challenging chapter. He shows how a number of people who are even standing on the edge of the church or even outside the church have made the comment, why should we believe what you are trying to convince us of when people who make the same confession that you do don't really believe it? That is, they don't place their faith in Scripture. And he basically says that this is akin to idolatry and prostitution. He's very, very strong. This is the strongest chapter in the book in terms of the way that he deals with the whole issue of orthodoxy, something that Chesterton wrote about in his book with the same title, Orthodoxy. And what he wants to make clear here is that we have a faith, and this faith dates back into the recesses of history. Christ was 2,000 years ago, nearly, and the Old Testament faith longer ago even than that. But we face a world today in which there's what he calls a chronological snobbery, that if it isn't recent, it must not be true. If it isn't something that's just come up with in our day and time, then there's a problem with it. Has a couple of great quotes from Chesterton and C.S. Lewis on the whole issue of chronological snobbery. And then as he comes down to the end of the chapter, he says, really, rather than calling this new version of the faith liberal, we should call it revisionist. Because that's what these people are doing, even in evangelical circles. And he has some of his strongest complaints right at the end of the chapter, the last 3 or 4 pages, against emergent evangelicalism and the fact that it's really basing its epistemology on the world around us today, on contemporary philosophy and art, on what the pagans believe in an attempt to win them. And one of the great statements in this chapter, he talks about how, no, we should not let the pagan world set our agenda. We should set the agenda. We should set the agenda for what is truth, because the Bible itself sets the agenda. And rather than letting our theology be molded by the current secular tides that are all around us, we should lash ourselves to Scripture and let it be our guide and the orthodox interpretation of Scripture. Finally, chapter 12 talks about the journey. It's a great chapter. We've all read and discussed and probably talked about life as a journey. I like how at the beginning of the chapter he cites Dante and Chaucer and Virgil and John Bunyan and Cervantes and Mark Twain and Joseph Conrad and Hermann Hesse and Jack Kerouac as all being people who've spoken of life as a journey. So I think that's a good starting point. Almost anybody that you would speak to in an apologetic context would have some sympathy for one of those characters, especially for the Buddha in Hermann Hesse, Siddhartha, and Kerouac's On the Road. People have an affinity for that kind of thing. So let's talk about the journey. He says, let's enter into this discussion of the journey. And then he mentions 4 stages, and I'm just going to have to not go through them with you here, but point you to them. I think that this is a fitting way to end this book, to talk about the 4 stages in a person's life who is potentially a seeking person, a person who might be persuadable. Remember, the whole book is about persuasion. And so I would suggest you read the last 10 or 12 pages of this book very carefully, because the 4 stages that people go through in reassessing their lives and their presuppositions and entertaining the possibility of something new, I think that's a very real, a very practical way of looking at the task of persuasion.